Hi, this is my review of Midevil Deluxe. Midevil Deluxe is a spin-off of the popular Zombies board game. That beer and pretzels game where you have to move your playing piece across streets and buildings, trying to reach a helipad or trying to kill a specific number of zombies to win the game. This is quite similar, however, this is a tribute to the Army of Darkness movie from Evil Dead. There are many references to it. Now I'm going to talk about the quality and the gameplay at the same time as I look at the components. First we have the box. Let me see if I can get that into focus without too much glare. The box is basically the Necronomicon. As you can see here, these look like the pages of the book, and it's basically a Necronomicon. And the quality it's pretty good. It's actually quite sturdy and it keeps things together inside. But there are some scuff marks and the paint is coming off in certain parts, so that's a bit disappointing. But in general, it's a good quality box. Now, you have an instruction booklet, but it feels more like a pamphlet. It's basically normal paper, printed in black and white. And although the game is generally well explained in the instructions, there are some things that seem a bit disorganized. For example, at the start of the booklet you have object of the game, but they don't tell you exactly what you need to do to win the game. They just give you like a tongue-in-cheek description, and I think that they should have clarified the object of the game at the very beginning. It's nothing too big, it's just like a nitpick of mine. And there are some typos. So for example, in page 1 it says what you hold in your hands, and should be what you have in your hands. So the booklet isn't like the best, it's just decent. And then you have the skeletons figures, because this game is all about the skeletons. You have different colored skeletons. Each color is worth a different number of points. So you have the reds that are worth 2 points, the blue ones are worth 3 points. They're all basically the same. They just have like a shield and a spear, and they are, let's see if I can get that into better focus. They have sort of like a medieval armor of sorts, all torn, and they have like an aspect of decay of sorts. And you have the white skeletons that are worth just 1 point. And you also have the black skeletons that they aren't worth any points at all, but they are quite lethal and dangerous. And then you have the plastic pawns that represent the players and the lives of the players. So for example, this pawn right here, it represents the player, and as you can see, it looks like a really pulpy hero. It kind of looks like Ash from Evil Dead, but he's basically using a sword and a gun, so it's not exactly Ash. And you can't really tell, but he's dressed in jeans and a shirt. So these miniatures are quite useful for proxies if you're playing a tabletop RPG or some other type of tabletop board game or war game, and you need like a pulp hero. You could use one of these pawns as proxies. You have other colors. You have a green, yellow, and orange, brown, I think, yes. And the other pawns represent the lives that you get while moving across the tiles in the game. They are basically the same as the player pieces. They also represent peasants according to certain cards. You also have a pair of dice. They're quite simple, just blue and red. And you have some cards, and I will talk about the cards as I go through the gameplay. Let's talk about the gameplay. Well, the main objective is basically killing skeletons until you get 30 points worth of skeletons. Or you could also search for the Necronomicon that appears at the graveyard. Here's the card representing the Necronomicon. And once you get the Necronomicon, you have to take it to back at the altar. That is the starting area. Now this game is actually 3 games in one: Medieval 1, 2, and 3. So I'm talking about Medieval 1 at first. Let me tell you about the structure of the turn. Each turn, you draw a tile from the tile deck. And these are the tiles that you get. Here you have the starting area, which is the altar. The tiles are appropriately moody. They're kind of like a haunted forest of sorts. And there are different types of tiles. You have some that are like... let me see if I can... Okay, there it is. They're kind of like open areas. You have some others that have buildings. Some cards actually allow you to manipulate the entrance and getting out of a building. So it adds a bit of strategy to the game overall, although this game is heavily luck based. You have some other tiles that are narrow passageways or paths. And so you draw a tile and you place it in a little space. That is, the players have to be able to go through that tile. And then you fight any skeletons that are on your current space. That is, maybe in a previous turn you ended up with a skeleton on your space and now you have to fight it first. I will talk about combat in a bit. And then you draw back up to 3 event cards. Event cards are the ones that you're going to be using to make life quite difficult for your opponents, and they will give you advantages to you as well. So for example, you have this card that it says, it's just a flesh wound. And this card says, play this card to return any 5 skeletons that were removed from the game and place them on any legal spaces on the board. And you also have some other cards, like for example this one that give me that before you hurt yourself. As you can see, they are quite, some of them are gory and generally pulpy. And this allows you to play this card to look at another player's hand. Pay the other player 1 skeleton for each card you take from their hand. So many of these cards have references to pulpy scenes and moments from Evil Dead, Army of Darkness specifically, movie. And they allow you to take things from your opponent, or maybe have their pawn go back some spaces or even tiles. You also have some cards that trap other players inside buildings, etc. In the base game of Medieval 1, it's the cards are quite basic, quite easy to understand and use. But with Medieval 2 and Medieval 3, you have cards that are slightly more complex, although that's still an overstatement because this game is really easy to play. And so, as I was telling you, after drawing your event cards, you roll a 6-sided die, and the result is the spaces that you can move. And you move the number of spaces and fight any skeletons on the way. You roll a 6-sided die then to move that number of skeletons 1 space. For example, if you rolled a 3, you can move up to 3 skeletons 1 space each. And then you discard 1 event card from your hand. Let's talk about combat. Skeletons are the main enemy of the game, even though it's a competitive game, and they're going to be the things that you're going to be fighting most of the time. And the skeletons, once you land in a space containing a skeleton, or a skeleton lands on your space, when it is legal to do so, you fight that skeleton by rolling a 6-sided die. And you need to roll a 4, 5, or 6 to defeat that skeleton. If you defeat that skeleton, you take that skeleton. As I was telling you, each skeleton is worth a number of points. White skeletons are worth 1, red are worth 2, and blue are worth 3. But if you roll 1, 2, or 3, the skeleton is going to win, and the skeleton is going to hit you. So you can escape from this in 2 ways. Well, first of all, if you have skeletons, you can use skeleton points to raise the number that you roll. So if you rolled a 3, you could pay 1 point of skeletons, and your die would count as 4. Or if you have a life, which are scattered throughout the map, because each tile gives you a number of pawns that appear in different inside buildings or in the pathways and such. So these pawns give you a reroll during a skeleton fight. Excuse me. Okay. And so you try to win against these skeletons to collect skeletons, and you use these skeletons as currency to play different cards. There are some weapons in the game that cannot be used unless you pay a number of skeletons, so that those cards become activated. So for example, and sometimes you need to kill a skeleton to activate that card, like a crossbow. This is sort of like a ranged weapon. Let me see if I can get that into... okay. And to activate this card, you need to kill a red skeleton, then you can play it in front of you. So there are many cards like maces and axes and short bows that you either have to pay a skeleton to use it, or kill a skeleton to activate it. And so you start moving along, killing skeletons. And if a skeleton actually manages to kill you, and there is no permanent death in the standard rules, so your character just goes back to the beginning, losing all of the cards that you have played in front of you, and you lose all your skeleton points if you didn't use them, and any remaining lives that you didn't use, although it would be quite illogical not to use them. And so it's a bit of a setback. And there are some really, what would you say, annoying and negative things about this game with the standard rules. And at the end of this review, I'm going to mention my 2 house rules that turn this game into a really awesome experience. And if a player actually manages to reach the graveyard, the player can take the Necronomicon. Once the player takes the Necronomicon, he just needs to go back to the altar at the start, and other players can attack that player and have a duel of sorts to take the Necronomicon from that player. Each player rolls his die, and you kind of bid a number of skeletons and lives during that duel and see who rolled the highest number. And if there is a tie, the player holding the Necronomicon is going to win that, so you have to keep that in mind. So almost always when the graveyard appears, it becomes like a race, everybody trying to get their hands on the Necronomicon. And that's the most exciting part of the game. But as I was telling you, I have some criticisms. I will mention them in a few minutes. Now, Midevil 2 is basically the same as Midevil 1, but you have more tiles and new cards. These tiles are castle tiles. As you can see here, you have sort of like a tower, which is kind of like the starting point. And so you build a relatively big castle around the board. And you also have some new tiles, like for example, you have the filth, which is basically like this pile of refuse and rotten flesh and who knows what else. It serves like an obstacle, so that, for example, if you draw this tile, you can use it to block some other player's path, so that the player doesn't reach the graveyard, usually. And you also have the pit. If you remember from Army of Darkness, there is a scene where Ash is tossed into this a pit with a deadite, and so this card recreates that scene almost perfectly. Again, it serves like an obstacle. You play a card and you try to get a player inside that pit so that he wastes time trying to get out of it. And you also have the drawbridge. Every time you cross the drawbridge, there is a chance that instead of being open, it will be closed, and vice versa. So all of those are strategic elements to take into consideration when trying to race for the Necronomicon or killing skeletons to win by collecting 30 points worth of skeletons. You also have the black skeletons, and to kill a black skeleton you need to roll a 6. You can also use your skeleton points and weapons and lives to get a better chance of defeating a black skeleton, but the thing is with black skeletons, you do not get points by defeating them. So they're just there as obstacles, and they appear at the graveyard, so it's going to be quite difficult to defeat those black skeletons to get to the Necronomicon. And these black skeletons, I think that they bring some negative things to Medieval 2 because they just make the game take too long, overstay its welcome, because as they attack the players and most likely defeat them most of the time, you will be sent back to the start, and it just makes the game take too long. But with my couple of house rules that I will mention, the black skeletons actually become really fun and exciting, and even an additional weapon to use in the game. As to the cards in Medieval 2, they have more like a castle siege sort of flavor to them. That is, you have cards that grab skeletons from inside the castle and toss them outside at different pathways and tiles outside of the castle. And you also have some other cards that grab skeletons from outside of the castle and toss them back inside. So they're considered like strategic elements, and all of the cards have these really cool looking illustrations, like really comedic and pulpy. Buckethead is a very dangerous card. You basically cancel the turn of another player, and it's quite useful when a player has the Necronomicon or already has a lot of skeletons and you don't want that player to win. You use Buckethead and see if you can get ahead of that player. You can see this card also making a reference to Army of Darkness. This is my broomstick instead of my boomstick. This card, it says, no skeleton may enter the target player's square until the end of that player's next turn. This only applies to normal skeleton movement. I guess it has to do with manipulating the flow of skeleton points in the game. Now let's talk about Medieval 3. Medieval 3 adds a dungeon to the game. And this dungeon contains spell cards. You also have tiles that represent the entrances to that dungeon, and you can actually combine all three games, Medieval 1, 2, and 3. You usually take Medieval 1 and combine it with 2 or 3, but you can combine all three games, but that makes for a longer game. And as I was telling you, in the dungeons, you cannot backtrack. Once you enter the dungeon, you have to keep going and going, and you find these different spell cards with names. They're kind of like magic words in Latin, so you can combine different cards to produce effects that affect other players or may actually give you victory in Medieval 3. So for example, if you combine Appello Liber, you take a spell from the spell deck, or you combine Liber Mortem, you discard one spell card. Depends on what you want to do. And if, for example, if you combine Carpe Utilis Liber, you win at the altar with this combination of spells. So you get another chance of winning without getting the Necronomicon or killing a number of skeletons. There are some other more powerful spells, comparatively speaking. So for example, you have Mortem, the Mortem card. If you combine it with Carpe Mortem, you take one 6-sided dice of skeletons from another player. Or maybe you use Appello Mortem and you place one 6-sided die of skeletons on your current tile. So these cards modify gameplay in different ways. Now let me tell you what I think. Oh, before that, let me show you the tiles that serve as entrances to the dungeon. You have this tile that is a dungeon entrance. And you also have the dungeon altar. In Medieval 3, you do not have to take the Necronomicon to the starting spot or tile. You have to take it to the altar in this dungeon. So let me tell you overall what I think of Medieval Deluxe. I think that playing it as it is, out of the box with the standard rule set without tweaking or adding house rules, it's just a decent game. Medieval 1 is a good experience with just 2 or a maximum of 3 players, but when you play Medieval 2 or Medieval 3, it takes too long, especially Medieval 2. This game is too simple to be played for hours, and if you play, let's say, with 4 or perhaps even 6 players, it takes just too long because everybody is getting in each other's way, and so the game really overstays its welcome. Let's say somebody gets the Necronomicon and he's racing to the starting area, and maybe that tile, the graveyard tile where the Necronomicon is at, appeared very far away from the starting area, and somebody uses a card to return that player to the graveyard. It's going to feel like an endless race of sorts, and the skeletons are not always available for you to kill so that you win by getting points, because once you use skeletons, they are out of the game unless some special card or effect says otherwise. And as I was telling you, the black skeletons make the game take even longer. So I remember one time we were playing and one player used this card to return the black skeletons after they had been eliminated, and everybody was like, "No, why did you do that? No!" And so the game took, I think it took like 2.5 hours back then, perhaps even more. I'm not exactly sure, or it felt like that. So there are so many flaws with the gameplay. I don't know if it was a poor play testing or if there wasn't too much communication between the designers and developers and the play testers, but this game becomes numbingly repetitive and boring. Yeah, like your brain is kind of tired of doing the same thing over and over again, and so many cards make the game take too long. It almost feels like it never ends. So maybe because it's a beer and pretzels game, they think that you're going to be too drunk to notice, but the game is, unless you're playing Medieval 1 with 2 or a maximum of 3 players, the game feels quite awful. So I would just say that Medieval 1 is a decent game, and 2 and 3 are not really that good. 3, I think it's a bit better than 2, because of the spell cards, it's not that bad. But if you use my couple of house rules, this turns into an awesome experience, very competitive and tactical and strategic as well. And these are basically 2 modifications to the rules. The first one, there is permanent death. If your character loses a fight against a skeleton and you do not have lives remaining, you're out of the game. So this creates a situation where it's kind of like a king of the hill, the last player standing wins. So it's really exciting. You really start to see skeletons not as just some currency, you see them as actually as enemies, because sometimes you want skeleton points and you're actually moving the skeletons towards you so that you can kill them and gain those points. But with this rule, you have to consider, you're going to be thinking, do I have enough lives, or do I have the appropriate weapons to fight the skeletons? And that's a bit more of a challenge to the game, and it sometimes the games end quicker because of that. Sometimes players get unlucky or make poor choices, because this is about pushing your luck, and they get killed at the start and one player wins. And the other house rule that I have is that let's see, it was a permanent death. Oh yeah, reduce the number of skeletons that you need to win the game. If you, for example, if you're playing with 2 players, just 25 points worth of skeletons. If you're playing with 3 players, 20 points worth of skeletons, and so on. Adjust them to the needs of your group. Usually taking 5 skeletons of the amount needed to win to, and probably cap it at 15, make for a really exciting game. And that way, those cards that allow you to steal skeletons or destroy skeletons or whatever, or remove or move skeletons from one tile to another, become quite valuable, and the game becomes really strategic and tactical. And so that way the game doesn't take too long, because there is really no sure way to tell when the dungeon altar, in the case of the dungeon, or the graveyard is going to appear. That way everybody doesn't know exactly how things are going to play out. You could choose a number of tiles and place that tile underneath those, but then the game becomes somewhat predictable. So with these 2 house rules, the addition of permanent death and the reducing the number of skeleton points needed to win, games become really exciting and really fun, and because they end somewhat shortly, you want to play 2 or 3 times, and each session, well, each game takes around like between 20 or at max an hour, when otherwise there could be a couple of hours just rolling and moving, rolling and moving, rolling and moving, and getting players back to the starting place and moving players around and taking skeleton points. It feels like it just takes forever. So I would recommend that you get Midevil Deluxe. It's a pretty good deal because it's 3 games in one, but only if you use my house rules, or if you are willing to create your own tweaks and house rules. But playing it with the standard rule set, I wouldn't recommend it. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.